Hi everyone, my name is Jasmine, and I, as was introduced about me, was in the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA. For a little bit of background, Critical Race Studies looks at the relationship between law and race and racism, specifically the way that law and legal decisions have created racial categories over time and affected people's filtering into those categories. So I investigated the role of critical race studies and the theory behind critical race studies and the relationship between that and Sikhs in the United States. And I came up with this paper called Everything I'm Not Made Me Everything I Am. And for those of you that are wondering, yes, the title is inspired from a Kanye West song. And I'll explain a little bit of context as I go on. So background, in critical race studies, there's one of the central tenets is that race is a social construct. It's not biologically inevitable. There are no genetic characteristics possessed by all blacks, for example, but not by non-blacks. There are no genes that are common to all white people. Race is not marked by gene frequencies. In fact, greater genetic variation exists within quote-unquote racial groups than between them. And by a quick show of hands, who here prior to this talk thought race was a biological fact? It was inevitable and determined by biology. Okay, a couple people. That's the popular notion, is that race is biologically determined, when in fact the truth is that your race is constantly in flux. And I look at the fact, I trace that flux over a history of 1900 to the current in Sikhs in particular. Ian Haney-Lopez, who's a popular writer in the field of critical race studies, explains that race is neither an essence nor an illusion, but rather an ongoing, contradictory, self-reinforcing process subject to the macro forces of social and political struggle and the micro effects of daily decisions. So that's to say that race is created day in and day out, not just by politics and sort of the meta level of our society and discourse, but also by us as individuals, how we interact with each other within our racial groups, also between racial groups. So racialization, that's the central point of the paper, is to talk about this process. And the process is one whereby individuals are filtered into racial categories and then treated in a certain manner based on meanings that are attached to those racial categories. Another term for racialization is racial formation, and this has been explained through the use of what's called racial schemas. You'll have to pardon my poor PowerPoint skills. Racial schemas are cognitive structures that represent knowledge about a concept or a type of stimulus, including its attributes and the relations among those attributes. So it's basically a structure used to think about other things, a way to put things in boxes for us to be able to think about them more easily. So society provides us as perceivers with sets of racial categories into which we map individuals who are the targets. After a person is assigned a racial category, certain meanings, both implicit and explicit, associated with that category are triggered. The racial meanings then influence and our interpersonal interactions with the target. So if you take a look at the map that I have set out, it's the individual on the one hand side. I should point where you are looking. The individual is mapped using certain mapping rules, and those mapping rules include a variety of things that I'll explain in a minute. And those people are put into certain racial categories. The categories are ones that we're all familiar with: white, black, Asian, Latino, Hispanic, etc. Those categories activate certain meanings. So a meaning associated with Asian previously might have been really smart. Now might have been awesome basketball player. Totally depends on context. That alters interactions with the individual. So the fact that this map exists shows us that all of the components of the racial map are socially constructed. The tools, the categories, and the meanings are contingent, constructed, and contestable. That means they're contingent on time and place. They're constructed by us as well as a meta level of society, and they're contestable, meaning that we can challenge not just their existence, but also their accuracy. Thus, they're not biologically inevitable. What might be biologically inevitable, and a question that is always remaining when we have the discussion of race as a social construct, is, but what I look like must come from somewhere, right? That's my biology, right? And that influences what racial category I'm placed into. That is simply one of the tools. Your phenotype is a biological truth. That's one of the tools that's used to place you into a category at a certain time. That doesn't mean that other tools don't exist. For example, phenotype is one, we just went over that. Nationality might be another. Language is another. Descent, another, as well as religion. All of these tools influence where certain individuals are placed at any given moment of time. So if I was in Arizona, for example, where I grew up, people might map me into the Mexican category based on my appearance and having lived in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. If I was presenting in California in English, people might naturally, based on my phenotype, filter me into the Indian category or the Indian race, right? But let's say I was in San Francisco, looking as I look, but speaking in fluent Spanish. My language might cause me to be mapped into the Latino category as opposed to the Indian. So these are all variables that, like I said, are contested and challengeable at any given moment. They're in flux. And that's also to say that religion can become a racial category. So we see this in the post 9/11 era. Prior to that, there were Christianity had been prevalent across racial categories. So that was used at different moments to filter different individuals into categories. But as different religions came into the US, there were different moments where people were placed into categories based on their religion alone. For example, the Muslim category or the Sikh racial category. Historically, religion has informed a perceiver's willingness to place certain non-white targets into the white category based on their acceptance into Christianity, or their acceptance of Christianity. One of the seminal race cases that we discuss in critical race studies is in Racialization. And in that case, an Armenian American was seeking naturalization. And the court said that religion plays a role in the perception of that Armenian target as Western and assimilated, and therefore he could be placed into the white racial category. This has also pertained to Mexicans and African American slaves who accepted Christianity at times. But the target isn't the only person doing the work. The map goes in two different directions. So while the perceiver might put the target into certain racial categories that trigger meanings that affect the interaction, it also goes the other way. The target might respond and map that the tools that are used are defective. So you shouldn't be using my phenotype or my language, for example, to place me into certain categories, is one argument. You might also argue that you're being placed into the wrong racial category altogether, or that the right category hasn't been created for you yet. So you're challenging the category. Third, you might argue that the meanings that are associated to the racial categories that you're put into, i.e. really smart, or really lazy, or criminal, or perpetually foreign, any of those meanings you might say are problematic, so you're going to push back on those. And what I use, the cognitive structure I use to discuss that is W.E.B. Du Bois' idea in The Soul of Black Folk, where he talks about always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. So this tape, or what's used to measure others, is internalized. Us as targets view how the outside world sees us, and we respond in these three ways. So I made an attempt to put this into a cognitive structure, again, a schema, using my awesome PowerPoint skills. So the perceiver uses the mapping tools, as I said, to place targets into categories that activate meanings that influence our interaction between the target and the perceiver, right? And we put the target right in the middle of that map. And the target can either respond to the mapping tools, or to the categories, or to the meanings, or all three at any given moment in time. So what does all of this have to do with Sikhs and this paper? So as I said, everything I'm not made me everything I am. There are moments where in challenging the racialization process, in challenging the tools, the categories, and the meanings, The response is to say, I am not that, so I am this. And that's the process of racial distancing or brokering. And so Sikhs have long had an experience, and it's not unique to us. It's common in the racialization process of several groups to say, define me based not on what I am, but what I'm not, because that's what defines who I am. So that's where the title of the paper came from. So the point of the paper was to investigate how a Sikh can respond to the mapping tools that have been applied to him or her, to the categories that he or she has been placed into, to the meanings attached to those categories. But importantly, how can Sikhs respond in ways that do not reinscribe the existing racial hierarchy, with white being at top, other races being below? So this paper analyzes the way Sikhs have been racialized over time, and also their responses at those different historical moments. For some context for that history, it's important to understand the Sikh psyche, because that influences our responses to racialization from the earliest immigration to today. Some of those responses are informed by our collective history and past, an important part of which was our conflict with the Mughal Empire in the 1600s and even before. Because of the conflict between Muslims and Sikhs, that has driven a large part of the Sikh psyche to distance themselves from members of the Muslim religion, especially in popular perception. As a result of that conflict with the Mughal Empire, there was an increased militarization and politicization of our identity. So it wasn't just that Sikhs are a religious group, but that they're actually a separate nation state deserving of a sovereign land, Khalistan. But even before that entire movement, there was a construction of the Sikh identity, and that outward identity has been defining for Sikhs. And part of that definition and its movement over time was a relationship with the British as well. The British referred to Sikhs as, quote unquote, the martial race. And Sikhs embraced that notion and used it to set themselves apart from a lot of other India during the time of the British colonial rule. This has also influenced the Sikh psyche in terms of our response to our racialization. Beyond that, there's also the historical experience of warding off attempts at conversion and co-option. Specifically, there was an entire movement to bring Sikhism within the fold of Hinduism, to co-opt the religion. And there was a pamphlet debate in the early 1900s about saying Sikhs are Hindus and Sikhs saying, no, we're not Hindus. There's also an interesting relationship as a result of the Sikh genocide in 1984 between Sikhs and the Hindu majority government, and efforts within Sikhism to sort of separate the religion, again, as the nation state from the rest of India, and continuing modern day attempts at showing Sikhism as a sect, whether that be through popular American culture and even more particularly in Bollywood culture. So the paper goes through this analysis in 3 historical time periods. The first is the 1900s to the 1950s. During that time period, Sikhs comprised nearly 90% of the original Asian Indian immigrants to the United States. The response to that immigration was negative. It was termed the Hindu invasion, Hindu being used as a derogative term, the tide of turbans. And as a result, there arose organizations such as the Asiatic Exclusion League, which were developed for the primary purpose of keeping Indian laborers, particularly Sikh Indian laborers, from immigrating first and from owning land second. As a result, they were able to lobby and get the California Alien Land Law Act of 1913 passed, which prevented land ownership by immigrants. Followed by the Immigration Act of 1917, which prevented the immigration of Indian laborers, period. And an interesting story, and critical race studies is also about personal narrative. So it's about injecting these legal facts with what our truths are. And I think that's important, especially within our culture. So my great uncle actually moved to the US in the 1920s. And for those of you who have read The Grapes of Wrath, was an Okie and moved westward to Arizona and was able to, unbarred by anti-miscegenation laws that prevented people of color from marrying white women, was able to marry a white woman who bought land under her name because he was not allowed to buy land under his name in the state of Arizona. That land then facilitated the immigration of pretty much my entire family to the state of Arizona. And it's interesting to have this personal relationship with the Immigration Act as well as the Alien Land Law Act that was not just in California but several other states, to see that despite the presence of those acts, there was still popular Sikh farming and land ownership that was able to take place, especially in later periods of time. And of paramount concern during this time was naturalization. People wanted to come to the United States and be able to become citizens. And the two primary cases were Ozawa v. United States and United States versus Thin. So Ozawa came first. The statute for naturalization at the time was that naturalization was only afforded to free white persons and to aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. Thus, Ozawa, who was a Japanese-American individual, argued that he was white. He argued that based on his phenotype, he looked as a white person looked. I don't have a picture, but if you saw it, it would be interesting. He looked white. He argued that based on his language, he should be filtered into the white category. He argued to the Supreme Court that he did not speak Japanese. His wife did not speak Japanese. He forbade his wife from speaking Japanese in the house. He prevented his children from learning the Japanese language. And he prevented all affiliation with Japanese Americans. So based on his phenotype, his language, and his affiliations, he said, I am white. Not only that, but I'm Christian, so I should be allowed in the white Caucasian category. The court said, too bad. In order to be white, you have to be Caucasian. So your skin color doesn't matter, your language doesn't matter, your affiliations don't matter, your perceptions don't matter, so you cannot be classified as white. So Thin thought, okay, I'm going to take advantage of the Supreme Court's holding and make my arguments that I'm Caucasian. So that's what he did. He submitted a brief to the Supreme Court after appeals, relying on what I call the mapping tools to map him into the white category. He said that where he was from in India was individuals were descended from Aryans because of the way they had traveled around in India. So he was Aryan. And he argued that his language was an Aryan language and that there was never any language superimposed on his people. So based on his descent and based on his language, he should be Aryan, or he should be Caucasian. In addition, he made specific reference in a majority of his brief to his religion and why that should put him into the Caucasian category. He said that as a high-class Hindu, and this is a Sikh man observing the Sikh faith, he said, as a high-class Hindu, I have strict adherence to the caste system. And I quote, there is no melting pot in India. The high-class Hindu regards the Aboriginal Indian Mongoloid in the same manner as the American regards the Negro, speaking from a matrimonial standpoint. It would be just as disgraceful for a high-class Hindu to marry a member of one of the lower castes as it would be for an American gentleman to marry a member of the Negro race. This is a Punjabi Sikh man taking advantage of the Hindu caste system to make certain arguments about his race and how that should filter him into certain racial categories. So he said, my religion should be used as a tool to put me into the Caucasian category. The problem, however, was that his arguments about these tools re-inscribed the racial hierarchy. They placed white and pure classes at the top and darker or African American or African at the time classes at the bottom. So his language specifically re-inscribed the hierarchy in a negative way. In regards to the category that he wanted to be placed into, he didn't resist the Hindu racial category. He was fine with that. What he wanted to do was move the Hindu category out of a place of its own or out of a place of potentially being regarded as the Negro category and into the white category. There was no discussion of whether the black category included certain Hindus, included the lower caste Hindus. There was simply no discussion of the other stratas of society in the Hindu high class system. And throughout Thin's brief, he only made reference to the fact that he was Sikh once, and that was in order to argue that he was Aryan. So his reference to his identity was very manipulated, but he was incentivized to manipulate it because of the fact that naturalization was restricted to only white people. So the arguments regarding the meanings attached to the categories, again, he didn't challenge the fact that he was Hindu. Instead, he challenged the meaning that had been attached to certain stratas of the Hindu subcategory. The repercussions. In order to advance one's position in the breadline to naturalization, and I call it the breadline because there was a notion that only certain people were allowed to, quote unquote, eat the bread. Only certain people were allowed to become white, right? So it's a limited and scarce resource that people are vying for. And in order to advance one's position, to get to that whiteness faster, you have to pull from and reconfirm the existing racial hierarchy. Tell the people who are making the decisions, look, I'm more like you and less like them, so you should let me ahead of line. I should cut and get to whiteness faster than they can. And that actually turns out to perpetuate the tools that support white supremacy. So his argument was that everything he was not made him everything that he was. The court, however, is a little tricky. They said, hold up, what we really meant in Ozawa was Caucasian in its popular sense, not in its scientific sense. But didn't we just see that the court in Ozawa actually said the opposite? In Ozawa's popular sense, he was Caucasian. His perceptions, his affiliations, his language, his religion, he was Caucasian under the popular sense. But the court decided to keep this individual, to keep thinned out of the white category by manipulating the law. So this is the relationship between law and race, that critical race studies, this is sort of the part that gets us the most excited, is to see the way the court shifts in order to make certain decisions that are self-serving and that perpetuate a certain existing racial hierarchy. Thus, the court held that in order to be Caucasian, you had to be someone that the framers of the Constitution would know as white. You would have to be the bone of their bone, the flesh of their flesh. And if you were not, you could not naturalize as a citizen. So the second historical period I looked at was the 1950s to the 1980s. And I'm going to kind of gloss over this in my presentation because I think the latter period is more relevant for our discussion today. But a couple interesting things from this period to note are that Dalip Singh Sandh was the first South Asian to win a seat in US Congress during this time out of California. For organizing purposes, he actually also embraced the Hindu category. And that was for the point of rallying around an identity. And he didn't resist the identity when his competitors or his opponents would throw it out and call him Hindu in a derogatory way. What's also interesting to talk about in this historical period is the notion of essentialism. So Dalip Singh Sandh had conflicting reports about his life. There were some articles that had written about him as having unshorn hair. He kept a turban and a beard. But based on pictures and narratives, we know that that's not the case. So a lot of people might ask, how can you talk about an entire group of people when some have turban and beard and others do not? So there's this idea that what I'm doing is, essentializing. I'm talking about everybody, I'm boiling you all down into one group, and I'm essentializing and talking about everybody at once. But there's actually, there's negative ways of doing that. For example, negative essentialism would be saying all brown people are terrorists. But there's also positive or strategic essentialism, which Spivak talks about, which is a way of talking about members of a group in a way that advances our knowledge about those members and a way that helps us learn more about their experiences. So regardless of the fact that certain members of the Sikh society might have differential racialization, where they experience this process a little bit differently, that doesn't mean that those processes aren't interrelated and that we can't learn from them and from each other within the community. So the historical period that I find sort of really challenging and exciting to talk about is the 1980s to the present. The historical circumstances were a lot of Sikhs post-1984 were applying for political asylum to come to the United States after the Sikh genocide. Those individuals were really charged with this notion of the separate Sikh nation state, the separate Sikh identity, sort of an anti-India mindset. In addition, during this time, there were more non-Sikh South Asians immigrating to the US than there were Sikhs, which is a direct flip of the period from the 1900s to the 1950s. So Sikhs are clearly a minority in this immigration period. And what marks this period are several instances of mistaken identity and targeting of Sikh identity. First, the mistaken identity. I chose in my paper to outline a couple narrative stories that were experienced and on sort of a higher level. The first of which is the hijacking of an Indian Airlines jet on December 25th of 1999. Several newspaper articles, including the New York Times, ran lengthy articles saying that Sikh men had hijacked the Indian Airlines jet and were making certain demands. It turns out that the people that actually hijacked the plane were Muslim. And the response to that is not just in terms of the tools that were used to map those Sikh men into the Muslim men into the Sikh category and vice versa, but also to the category that these individuals were being placed into. And we'll get into that. A second instance of mistaken identity, and one that has really marked all of our lives, is September 11th. And we'll discuss that momentarily. There's also the targeting of Sikh identity, specifically the TSA and airport searches. And second, the treatment of a Sikh family in Houston in November of 2008, where a family called about a burglary attempt. The police came to their house and actually ended up putting a taser to the head of the woman that called for police assistance and handcuffing a 65-year-old woman, a Sikh grandmother who was in the home as well, and saying that we know who you people are, we know what your people did, was the response of the police. The third instance that I talk about in my paper is the US Airways incident in November of 2008, where the pilots of the plane actually refused to take off until 3 Sikh men were asked to leave the flight. So in this period, the response was, your tools are putting us in the wrong category. For example, after the hijacking of the Indian Airlines jet in 1999, several individuals, one of whom is Deep actually, wrote into newspapers saying, you misidentified in this article and said that Sikhs hijacked this plane, when in fact it wasn't a Sikh at all, it was a Muslim. The same thing, or a very similar thing, happened post 9/11. There were placards and posters and marches of Sikh people saying, we need to explain to Bush who the Sikh people are and prove that Sikhs are not Muslims, because we are getting the blame for what they did. They did. So the argument was that our phenotype, our turban and beard, our religion, being Sikhs, should take us out of this Muslim category or out of the terrorist category and put us in our own category of Sikhs. That's our racial category. That's the right category. And the incentives were a little different, right? After the 1999 hijacking, the incentive was not out of fear for our safety, it was accuracy. You are simply wrong about the way you're describing this situation. We're Sikhs and we deserve our own category. After September 11th, I think the incentive was a little different. There was fear of backlash, fear of profiling. And so the incentive was, put us in the right category, otherwise we are going to start getting attacked. Another response was the decreasing of racial salience. For example, men and women cutting their hair, men and women choosing not to wear a bug or a turban anymore, or choosing to mask the identity by wearing a hat. So this is another way to manipulate one's salience via racial performance and phenotype, which is a racial mapping tool, in order to change the way that people are mapped into certain categories. There was also the option of resisting the racial categories. So this is related to resisting the racial tools. In response to 1999, the response was, Sikhs are not Muslims, and we don't deserve, quote unquote, punishment for their bad acts. But this response suggests that they, as a group, are to blame. This is the very sentiment that informs racial profiling. The terrorist is a member of Group X, therefore all members of Group X must be terrorists, and so we don't want to be seen as Group X. That's the response. And that's the notion that all racial groups are seen as fungible. One can be mistaken for another or even substituted in for another over any given period of time. And we don't, the response was, we don't want to get wrapped up in that confusion, so put us in the right place. There was a similar response to 9/11, which is the again, what I described as the attempt at explaining that Sikhs are not Muslim. This implicitly sent the message that because Sikhs did not commit the acts in question, they were innocent, but that all Muslims were to blame. It's important to realize that Sikhs are not unique in taking this response or in reacting this way. As a matter of fact, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Chinese individuals actually wore buttons that said "not from Nippon," so they wouldn't be blamed for the bombing, so that they wouldn't suffer the same fate that the Japanese were suffering, example, internment. This is also seen during the LA riots in the brokering between Korean Americans and African Americans. There was a divide in terms of who was to blame for the riots. African Americans were claiming American identity and American loyalty and saying that Koreans were not American, they were foreign, they were perpetually foreign, and they weren't really loyal to this country. Korean Americans, however, responded by saying our work ethics and our value are American, so you should see us as better than African Americans in this debate. So the Sikh response isn't a novel or a new one. It's actually totally interrelated with the way that several racial categories and groups have responded to their racialization. And again, this goes back to my point about the breadline earlier. This illustrates the construction of a breadline to American identity and acceptance. Members of these groups think that in order to be accepted, they have to argue that they are better in some way or another than another group. Racial brokering is one group's attempt to position itself as superior to other groups. The problem with this, however, is that it locates the issue as between those two groups, and it obscures the role that whiteness and white supremacy and the role that white supremacy plays in facilitating that discussion. In addition, the resistance to the categories at the time, this is actually the normative conclusion of the paper. It's that resisting the negative categories or the negative meanings that are attached to our categories is actually the best response we can come up with. So at one point during post 9/11 discourse, people started saying, you know what, maybe we shouldn't say we are not Muslim because that's problematic. Our Muslim brothers and sisters are actually being attacked because of what we're saying. So there was an effort to fight profiling across the board, to fight the negative connotation that went with all racial categories, not just ours. And that, that's continued with community-based initiatives and community building via SALDIF and the Sikh Coalition. They've made strides in terms of coming together as a community and fighting racial profiling overall and not just for our community, so that they can challenge the negative associations with categories, period, as opposed to just the categories that we're filtered into. So the normative conclusions of the paper are that arguing for different mapping tools can actually be problematic because the recommended tools are not often better at resisting subordination than the existing ones. See, for example, the thin case that I was talking about. In addition, the tools are often the result of the incentives of the racial hierarchy. Requesting new tools does not always lead to long-term change because the tools can change over time and be manipulated. Second, claiming that you've been placed into the wrong category can implicitly condone violence against members of the denied category. So requesting a separate category might implicate or suggest that you are experiencing racialization in a way that's totally distinct from another group, let's say Latinos, when in fact the processes are completely interconnected. Requesting a separate category is a form of racial distancing if done in a negative way. And it deploys the same rhetoric and attitudes that inform and support the racial hierarchy. So resisting the meanings that are attached to the categories is the best for assuring that one does not engage in the subordination of other communities of color. So by realizing that the processes are interconnected, that's the best means for Sikhs to combat the negative parts of racialization and stay true to the founding principles of the Khalsa, which are to fight injustice everywhere and not just for ourselves.